Every age produces its own illusions. Ideas that promise liberation, yet recreate the very chains they claim to break. In 2021, the world discovered NFTs, 3 letters that for a lifelong moment seemed to rewrite the meaning of value. Digital art was no longer merely displayed, it was owned. And ownership itself, we were told, had been re-engineered for the blockchain age. Headlines proclaimed a new renaissance of creativity. Beeple's Every Day sold at Christie's for $69 million. A JPEG arrangement of pixels, infinitely replicable, suddenly commanded the same price as a base squat. The promise was metaphysical scarcity without substance, possession without the burden of physical matter. But beneath the excitement was the silence we noticed. The silence was the absence of inquiry, the pause between what a thing is and what we believe it to be. And it is in that silence that bubbles are born. Like every financial revolution before it, the NFT boom began as a rebellion against gatekeepers. Artists tired of middlemen, traders tired of banks, dreamers tired of permission. The blockchain appeared as a perfect weapon, a public ledger immune to censorship. Yet as the philosopher Spinoza warned, freedom without understanding is the most seductive form of bondage. What began as liberation soon became replication. The decentralized dream turned into a digital mirror of the same hierarchies. A few at the top, controlling most of the wealth, and the many chasing meaning through symbols they could barely define. By the end of that year, owning a token meant little more than holding a line of code pointing to a file stored on someone else's server. The NFT was not the artwork, it was a receipt. And as with any receipt, its value depended not on what it represented, but on what others believe it represented. That is a paradox of digital ownership. The more abstract it becomes, the more it relies on collective faith. And faith, once financialized, behaves like leverage. It compounds, beautifully on the way up, catastrophically on the way down. In truth, NFTs were not a technological breakthrough. They were a sociological revelation, proof that belief itself became the final commodity of late capitalism. To see NFTs clearly, one must just remember that financial history is not linear, it is cyclical, a theater that changes its props, but never its script. In 17th century Holland, tulips became symbols of sophistication. A single bulb could trade for the price of a house. And in the 18th century England, the South Sea Company promised wealth from imperial trade, an empire built on rumor. And in the late 1990s, .com IPOs turned domain names into dreams of infinite scalability. And in our time, blockchain tokens carry the same refrain. This time, it's different. But as Polybius noted in the ancient republics, human behavior repeats itself with mathematical precision. Innovation becomes euphoria. Euphoria invites imitation. Imitation dilutes quality until only narrative remains. Then when faith falters, the cycle collapses under its own idealism. The economist Hyman Minsky called this the moment of euphoria, the stage when every participant justifies risk through novelty. In NFTs, novelty was mistaken for innovation, rarity was mistaken for value, and marketing was mistaken for community. And the bubble did not grow because people misunderstood the technology. It grew because they understood the story. The same story that fuels every mania, that scarcity plus belonging equals wealth. The platforms encouraged it. Twitter avatars became tribal banners. Discord servers evolved into miniature republics where identity was collateral. And in the digital coliseum of speculators, silence equaled death. To question the narrative was to exile oneself from the tribe. John Maynard Keynes once compared financial markets to a beauty contest where judges choose not the face they find most beautiful, but the face they believe others will favor. NFTs were the contest digitized. Investors did not buy what they loved, they bought what they believed others would love next. The result was a perfect feedback loop, a marketplace of mirrors, where everyone's reflection looked like profit. When every reflection looks like profit, truth becomes irrelevant. And when truth becomes irrelevant, collapse becomes inevitable. By mid-2022, the illusion began to crack. Liquidity vanished. Projects once valued in the millions were abandoned overnight. The crowd that once shouted, "We're all going to make it," quietly disappeared into the same anonymity from which it came. The ancient historian Herodian wrote that the Roman crowd always demanded 2 things, bread and spectacle. In our century, the spectacle was the blockchain, and the bread was the belief. To understand why the NFT dream unraveled, we must return to its origin, the Genesis block of Bitcoin, 2009. Printed into that first line of code were the words, The Times, 03 Jan 2009, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. It was not a technical statement, it was a moral one. Bitcoin was conceived as a rebellion, a protest encoded in mathematics. It offered what the 20th century never achieved, a monetary system ruled by rules, not rulers. Milton Friedman once envisioned precisely this, a world where money supply followed a predictable formula, immune to political interference. John Maynard Keynes, his opposite, argued that stability required active management, that economies, like organisms, must adapt or perish. And between these two extremes lay the eternal economic tension, order versus flexibility, rules versus discretion. Bitcoin appeared to solve it, algorithmic order that adapts through collective consensus. It was the mathematical harmony Friedman dreamed of, and the distributed adaptation Keynes demanded. It was in theory the synthesis of both, but in practice, it inherited the oldest weaknesses of all, human nature. Over time, mining centralized in massive data centers. A few pools control most of the hash power. Speculation overtook purpose. A currency designed for exchange became a field for hoarding. The dream of decentralization devolved into the same oligarchy it sought to escape. When a few control production and many worship scarcity, you no longer have freedom, you have ritual. Now enter George Soros. In The Alchemy of Finance, Soros proposed a concept that shattered the illusion of market objectivity, reflexivity. He argued that markets do not passively reflect reality, they actively shape it. Belief influences behavior, behavior influences outcome, and outcome validates belief. A feedback loop between perception and price. And Bitcoin became the ultimate proof of that theory. Its price rose not because its utility changed, but because belief amplified belief. And as the philosopher Aristotle warned, when imitation becomes indistinguishable from essence, tragedy follows. And Soros mastered that tragedy, turning awareness of illusion into advantage. Between 1973 and 1986, he outperformed market averages for 12 consecutive years, not by predicting, but by participating in the very psychology he analyzed. He did not treat markets as equations, but as ecosystems of emotion. Bitcoin and later NFTs were ecosystems of emotion at scale, global laboratories of reflexivity, where human sentiment were digitized and traded in real time. Every tweet, every meme, every moment of collective excitement was a monetary event. When Elon Musk changed his Twitter bio into #Bitcoin, the market added billions in minutes. A textbook display of perception, creating reality. But unlike Soros, who understood when to exit the illusion, crypto culture refused to. It moralized speculation as virtue. And when belief finally fractured, it had nowhere to land. No fundamentals, no cash flow, no anchor, only code and conviction. And as we know, conviction is not a balance sheet, and belief without architecture cannot survive silence. What began as a rebellion ended as recursion, a system eating its own narrative, chasing the same ghost of decentralization it could never catch. Bitcoin's story remains profound, but incomplete. It taught us that power can be distributed, but not that truth can be automated. It revealed the genius of open source governance, but also the fragility of faith when detached from structure. As Soros himself observed, markets are constantly in a state of uncertainty and flux, and money is made by discounting the obvious and betting on the unexpected. Crypto discounted the obvious, human psychology, and bet entirely on the unexpected perfect code. In doing so, it forgot that every algorithm eventually meets its mirror, the unpredictable, irrational, and infinitely reflexive mind of man. The market broke not because technology failed, but because architecture was never built. And when freedom outpaces the law, chaos fills the vacuum. The same crowd that once praised decentralization found itself craving order. The same developers who shouted, "Code is law," now prayed that someone, somewhere, would write an actual law. Because code can record behavior, but it can never judge it. Only institutions, moral, legal, or algorithmic, can decide where freedom ends and responsibility begins. And in that space between ideal and institution lived the illusion of NFTs, a digital asset without jurisdiction, a contract without a court. It was ownership without consequence, value without verification. In the spring of 2021, trading volumes exploded. 94 million in January became 25 billion by the year's end, according to Chainalysis. Most of it happened on decentralized exchanges, where identity dissolved into wallet addresses. It was a perfect storm of technology and temptation. A system designed to record trust became the instrument through which trust disappeared. Chris Brumer in Crypto Assets, Legal, Regulatory, and Monetary Perspectives wrote that the architecture is the invisible infrastructure that makes finance intelligible. He was describing a truth that the crypto world ignored. Regulation is not a cage, it is a scaffold. Without it, speculation climbs toward the sky until it collapses under its own weight. The 1920s had their bucket shops, the 2020s had Discord, and both enthusiasm masqueraded as due diligence. During the Jazz Age, stock pools secretly pumped prices before dumping them on the public. And a century later, anonymous influencers repeated the cycle, only faster. Same psychology, new interface. Brumer's research revealed that roughly 80% of early token projects either vanished or devolved into outright fraud, an echo of the pink sheet era before the SEC existed. Investors thought they were funding technology, but they were financing narratives. He warned that transparency is not bureaucracy, it is liquidity. When disclosure dies, markets suffocate in their own opacity. But hype doesn't read warnings. By the time policymakers noticed, the damage was cultural. Decentralization had become a moral identity. Any regulation felt like heresy. Yet history shows that ungoverned innovation always invites the very power it despises. After 1720, Britain created the Bubble Act to restore confidence. After 1929, America created the SEC. And after 2022, crypto will create something similar because chaos, once commercialized, always demands a referee. George Soros would have understood this perfectly. Decades earlier, he watched another illusion swell and burst. The global debt markets of the 1980s, the British pound in 1992. He learned that prices are not reflections of reality. They are instruments of persuasion. The prevailing bias, he wrote in The Alchemy of Finance, works like a self-fulfilling prophecy. When investors believe the pound will fall, their belief makes it fall. When traders believe a JPEG is worth millions, that belief holds, until disbelief spreads faster. Reflexivity, as Soros called it, the endless feedback between perception and outcome. Markets are not the thermometers, they are the thermostats. They do not measure temperature, they set it. And NFTs were the hottest fever modern finance ever recorded. Each tweet, each meme, each auction became a data point in a global experiment on collective emotion. A single celebrity endorsement could emit overnight millionaires. A single word could erase them. When Elon Musk changed his Twitter bio to #Bitcoin, capitalization surged by the tens of billions within minutes. Empirical proof that reality bends into reputation. Reflexivity once played out in months or years. Blockchain compressed it into seconds. The loop between thought and transaction became instantaneous. Belief no longer waited for quarterly reports. It traded itself. And as Soros mastered that loop by anticipating when the narrative would invert, he studied the psychology of turning points. When optimism becomes orthodoxy, when doubt becomes contagion. His method was philosophical, not merchant. He observed that uncertainty is permanent, but awareness of uncertainty can be profitable. That awareness, metacognition, was his edge. Crypto, by contrast, mistook automation for awareness. It encoded certainty into software and called it liberation. But certainty is brittle. When volatility struck, code could only execute. It could not empathize, adapt, or forgive. In May 2022, a stablecoin called Terra USD broke its peg to the dollar. Within 48 hours, 40 billion in paper wealth vanished. Algorithms meant to maintain equilibrium collapsed under panic selling. Reflexivity had turned recursive, machines amplifying human fear in real time. The lesson was ancient. Systems fail not from malice, but from misalignment. We build structures to manage emotion, then forget emotion built the structures. Every empire, every market, every blockchain carries within it the psychology of its creators. During his tenure at the London School of Economics, Soros studied under Karl Popper, who argued that all knowledge is provisional, all systems fallible. Soros extended that humility into finance. Certainty is an illusion sustained by confidence. Once confidence dies, even the strongest code becomes a corpse of syntax, and NFTs became that corpse. By mid-2022, floor prices evaporated, marketplaces froze withdrawals, Discord servers went silent. The art remained, but the audience is gone. The mirror cracked, and behind it stood only reflection of our own desire to matter. Yet there is value in collapse. Every failed experiment leaves behind data, psychological, cultural, and institutional. The NFT crash taught us that technology without governance breeds entropy, and governance without imagination breeds stagnation. Somewhere between those extremes lies the future. Boomer's architecture, Soros' reflexivity, Keynes' adaptability, and Freeman's rule-based order, all fragments of a larger mosaic. Each diagnose one limb of the same organism. We call the market. Freeman trusted discipline, Keynes trusted discretion, Soros trusted awareness, Boomer trusts structure. Together they describe what the next monetary evolution must be. A system conscious of its own limits. Because freedom is not the absence of rules, it is the presence of fair ones, and decentralization stripped of justice is merely disorder written in code. As the frenzy faded, serious builders returned to the fundamentals. They began asking questions, once exiled from crypto forums. Who ensures disclosure? Who audits reserves? Who bears liability when anonymity fails? These are not bureaucratic curiosities. They are the preconditions of trust. When nations created central banks, they did not do so to hoard power, but to domesticate panic. When the Securities Act of 1933 demanded that issues tell the truth, it turned confession into capital formation. History's great paradox is that transparency strengthens freedom. Light, not secrecy, preserves autonomy. Boomer's blueprint insists that decentralization and disclosure need not be enemies. Technology can automate honestly if designed for it. Smart contracts could include mandatory audit clauses. Oracles could publish verified trade data in real time. AI could monitor manipulation patterns and flag them before contagion spreads. Architecture, in this sense, is not political. It is mathematical empathy. But the lesson remains unfinished. Reflexivity still rules every speculative frontier, from meme stocks to metaverse land. Each innovation begins as an emancipation and ends as imitation, until a new generation relearns humility. George Soros once remarked during a 1994 lecture, "I am only rich because I know when I am wrong." It is the most radical confession of any investor ever made, because it reframes profit not as conquest, but as self-correction. To know when one is wrong requires a system that can listen to feedback. Crypto, built to resist interference, also resisted introspection. And in that rigidity lay its downfall. If reflexivity is inevitable, then awareness must become design. Imagine a network that not only records transactions, but interprets their emotional velocity. A system that sees when belief overheats and adjusts supply before collapse. That would be a market conscious of its own psychology. The dream of every economist since Keynes, and the terror of every speculator since Soros. We are not there yet, but every failure brings a blueprint closer. What the NFT era revealed is that we crave meaning as much as money. People didn't buy tokens for art, they bought participation in a myth of progress. And myths, once commercialized, always decay. But they leave behind language, and language shapes the next myth. The next myth must be one of equilibrium, not euphoria. It must merge the cold precision of code with the warm accountability of law. It must understand that decentralization without conscience is merely diffusion of risk. And conscience without data is merely sentiment. Boomer gave us a legal scaffolding, Soros a psychological mirror. And together they remind us that stability is not the enemy of innovation. It is its mother. As the decade closes, the fragments begin to converge. Central banks experiment with digital currencies. Private firms test tokenized real-world assets with regulated custody. Auditors explore zero-knowledge proofs to confirm solvency without revealing data. The dialectic continues. Control and chaos, order and freedom, thesis and antithesis, seek and synthesis. And if history remains faithful to its rhythm, that synthesis will emerge, not from the loudest innovators, but from the quietest architects, the ones who design systems sturdy enough to survive both the hype and the silence. Because markets, like civilizations, do not collapse when people lose money. They collapse when people lose faith. And faith, to endure, must be earned. That is the final law of reflexivity, the unwritten equation beneath every chart, every contract, every century. Every crisis exposes what society truly worships. In speculative eras, we claim to worship innovation, but what we really venerate is protection. Legal, contractual, institutional protection. When the smoke of each mania clears, those who remain solvent are never the boldest or the fastest. They are the ones whose claims are enforceable. It is here that Katharina Pister's The Code of Capital enters a conversation like a quiet revelation. She reminds us that capital is not born in markets. It is written into existence through law. Property, debt, equity, intellectual rights are not spontaneous facts in nature. They are agreements that the state promises to honor. Scripts of privilege disguised as neutral procedure. A plot of land becomes an asset only when a court defends its boundary. A patent becomes wealth only when the police enforce exclusivity. And a share certificate is valuable not because of the paper or the blockchain hash, but because entire institutions stand behind the sentence. This claim shall be recognized. The modern world runs on this invisible software. Pister calls it legal code of the true operating system of capitalism. Lawyers are its programmers, judges are its runtime environment. Every contract, every merger, every derivative is a line of code written in the syntax of enforceability. It is this code that converts ideas into income and property into power. History proves a pattern. In medieval Europe, merchants sought protection for trade routes, hence the birth of chartered corporations. In the 19th century, industrialists demanded limited liability, the right to risk capital without risking the self. And in the 20th century, finance coders engineered mortgage securities whose rights could outlive their creators. Each layer of the law multiplied wealth for those able to write the code and left the rest running unlicensed versions of the same economy. Digital assets repeat the story. For all the rebellion against the state, the successful projects quickly sought its shelter. Founders incorporated in tax havens, minted governance tokens that mimic shares, and wrote arbitration clauses into smart contract terms of service. Decentralization, once revolutionary, quietly re-centralized in legal wrappers. The rhetoric stayed anti-institutionalist, but the behavior returned to the courthouse. What Pister teaches, without moralism, only clarity, is that capitalism is a hierarchy of protection. Those nearest to the code, writers, hold assets that cannot easily die. Everyone else holds promises that can. If an NFT collapses, its holder has no recourse. But if a bank collapses, its shareholders still negotiate with the regulators. Protection is a true currency, and law is its mint. This realization reframes the NFT era. It was not a revolution of ownership. It was a mass experiment in unprotected property. People bought titles that no sovereign authority could enforce. They mistook visibility for security, and in doing so, they rediscovered what medieval peasants already knew. Possession without power is tenancy, by grace of those who possess enforcement. Pister writes, code, whether legal or digital, does not merely describe the word, it constitutes it. The brilliance of that sentence lies in its neutrality. The blockchain may constitute a new record of truth, but unless it plugs into a world willing to honor that truth, it remains an echo chamber of belief. For value to persist, law and ledger must eventually handshake. After every technological disruption, this handshake reappears. When the steam engine arrived, insurance and liability statutes followed. When telecommunication globalized finance, accounting standards emerged. When the internet exploded, intellectual property law metasized. And when the blockchain came, a legal vacuum appeared, soon to be filled by the same gravitational pull of protection that has always defined capital. The irony is perfect. Decentralization created a need for a new centralization, a trust of arbitration, of meaning. The cycle completes itself because civilization cannot trade uncertainty indefinitely. Even anarchy seeks a notary. So to understand the next stage of finance, we must therefore stop asking what money is and start asking who enforces it. Because enforcement is ontology. Without it, ownership is a story whispered to strangers. With it, ownership becomes reality. And if law remains a code of capital, the task before technologists is not to abolish it, but to translate it. To write the next grammar where digital rights are as enforceable as physical ones. Where contracts self-execute, but also self-report. Where transparency replaces confession, and accountability becomes infrastructure. The transition is already beginning quietly in the laboratories of both states and startups. It is not the destruction of capitalism, but its evolution. From the paper charter to the algorithmic covenant. After every collapse, the world begins to rebuild its scaffolding. The tulip mania produced the first regulated future contracts. The South Sea Bubble gave birth to joint stock governance. 1929 gave birth to the Securities Act and the modern vocabulary of disclosure. Each failure refines the grammar of trust. The NFT crash is no different. What it has left behind is not ruin, but revelation. A realization that technology alone cannot be a substitute for institutions. To transact is human. To govern the transaction is civilization. As economist Chris Boomer calls this missing element architecture. Not walls and ceilings, but the invisible geometry of rules that hold a market upright. Architecture transforms movement into stability. It turns liquidity into order. Without it, even the strongest code bends under the pressure of belief. Across the world, quiet experiments now attempt to draft that geometry anew. In Singapore, regulators require that stablecoin issuers prove real reserves. In the European Union, the MICA framework writes the first continental rulebook for digital assets. In the Gulf, sovereign wealth funds test blockchain settlement under state supervision. And in the United States, auditors explore zero-knowledge proofs, mathematical attestations that verify solvency without surrendering privacy. Each of these initiatives shares a single intuition that transparency, disclosure, and adaptability are not the enemies of freedom, but its precondition. To rebuild trust, markets must learn to measure themselves. Soros showed that perception distorts reality. And Boomer argues that disclosure can study that distortion by anchoring in verified data. Where reflexivity multiplies illusion, transparency introduces friction. And friction, paradoxically, is what prevents fire from consuming everything at once. The future belongs to systems that learn. Monetary networks capable of observing their own feedback loops and moderating them in real time. Imagine an infrastructure that monitors speculative heat, the way a thermostat tracks temperature. When leverage rises beyond sustainable thresholds, margin rules tighten automatically. When demand collapses, liquidity valves open by consensus of machine and law. This is not central planning, it is adaptive equilibrium. It merges Freeman's discipline with Keynes' responsiveness, Soros' reflexivity with Boomer's architecture, and beneath them all, Pister's insight that enforceability remains a spine of value. But architecture requires humility. It demands that designers acknowledge the limits of design. No algorithm will replace ethics. No statute will substitute for vigilance. The task is not to build a perfect market. There are none. But to build one that fails gracefully. The historian Will Durant once wrote that civilization is a stream with the banks. The banks will give the stream its direction. The stream erodes, the banks in turn. Law and technology are these banks, and currents. When law ossifies, innovation floods the plain. When innovation rages unchecked, law must carve new channels. The dialogue never ends. The conversation itself is progress. To speak of digital architecture is therefore to speak of design that listens. A framework where the ledgers of commerce echo the lessons of philosophy, that power must be accountable, that trust must be earned, that belief must be tested. Such architecture will not announce itself with hyper slogans. It will arrive quietly encoded in policy memos, white papers, and working protocols. The invisible craftsmanship of equilibrium will begin as a rebellion against civilization, may end as a renaissance of intelligent governance. And that is how history always reconciles its contradictions. Freedom discovers its structure. Order rediscovers its humanity. The next great innovation in money will not be a new coin, but a new constitution. One written in both code and conscience. Every generation mistakes its instruments for its destiny. The 17th century believed in ships and colonies. The 19th in factories and steam. The 20th in credit and consumption. Our century believed in code. Each faith carried the same conviction, that the mechanism itself would perfect the human condition. But history does not reward mechanisms. It rewards balance. The illusion of decentralization was not that it sought freedom. It was that it mistook structure for constraint. When the first blockchain was mined, it was described as trustless. But in truth, it trusted more deeply than any system before it. It trusted in mathematics, networks, and the moral neutrality of code. Yet neutrality, when embedded in markets, becomes partiality in disguise. Every algorithm expresses the biases of its authors, the data they collect, the incentives they choose, and the risks they ignore. Freedom without ethics turns quickly into permission for chaos. The challenge that now confronts digital finance is not scale, speed, or adoption. It is more design, the capacity to encode restraint without extinguishing creativity. That question is older than economics itself. It is a question of governance itself. When Plato asked how the just city should be ruled, he answered not with laws or coins, but with character. When Madison drafted the American Constitution, he wrote that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. And when the architects of post-war capitalism built the Bretton Woods system, they embedded the institutions precisely to counteract speculation. Each era discovered the same axiom. Power requires its opposite to remain humane. Crypto has now reached the same inflection point. Its rebellion succeeded. The gatekeepers have been humbled. But rebellion without construction is entropy. The infrastructure of the next economy will depend not on who shouts decentralization the loudest, but on who builds frameworks in which decentralization can survive its own success. And already the contours of the framework are visible. Central banks pilot digital currencies. Commercial banks tokenize deposits. Startups create on-chain treasuries, governed by mathematical constitutions. The vocabulary of law is slowly merging with the language of code. Regulators, once derided as obstacles, are becoming partners in design. The market, in turn, is learning humility, the awareness that no system remains self-stabilizing forever. As Soros proved, perception creates price, but as Pissa revealed, only enforceability preserves it. The synthesis is not utopian. It is pragmatic, almost biological. Systems adapt or die. The internet of value will mature, the way all ecosystems mature. Through feedback, constraint, and renewals, stable coins will be commoditized. DAOs will adopt charters, and tokens will represent claims tied to verifiable activity, rather than narrative. Speculation will persist, because speculation is curiosity in its most dangerous form. But it will coexist with transparency, strong enough to endure the next panic. In the long view, this is how civilizations evolve. Manias are not mistakes, they are experiments in belief. Each collapse reveals what society has outgrown. When tulips fell, finance learned to hedge. When railways crashed, it learned to diversify. When dot-coms imploded, it learned to measure traffic instead of talk. And when NFTs dissolved, the world learned to separate ownership from verification and to distinguish visibility from value. The next ascent, therefore, will begin on quieter ground. Its prophets will not promise riches. They will promise resilience. Its engineers will write protocols that listen before they act. Its investors will measure return, not only by profit, but in the durability of the system itself. In this new equation, transparency is the dividend, and credibility the yield. One can already sense a philosophical shift taking place. Markets are beginning to regard volatility not as a flaw, but as a teacher, a reminder that an equilibrium is not a place, but a process. The process of architecture is not to end uncertainty, it is to make uncertainty livable. When designed correctly, a market becomes less a battlefield and more a conversation between information and imagination, between regulation and revolt, between what is measured and what is believed. If there is a single law left unbroken by the age of code, it is the oldest. Every empire of value depends on trust. Trust is not the opposite of risk, it is the management of it. It is an unseen contrast that binds reason to emotion, price to purpose, and liberty to law. And without it, no algorithm can endure. With it, even fragile ideas cannot live their inventors. Perhaps this is how the story of money always ends. Not with conquest or collapse, but with the recognition that value is a mirror of our collective maturity. Each generation writes its reflection into currency, and the currency in turn teaches the generation who it really was. The dollar taught the world to scale. The euro taught it to cooperate. Crypto taught it to question. Whatever comes next will teach it to balance. And that balance will not emerge from ideology. It will emerge from iteration, from systems that fail and learn, from architecture that listens and adjusts. In that patient recursion lies the quiet genius of progress. Markets correct. Institutions evolve. And civilizations endure. The illusion of NFTs was never that they sought to free ownership. It was that they confused visibility with meaning, belief with structure, and motion with direction. Now the spectacle is over. And what remains is the work of builders, jurists, economists, engineers, philosophers, who must translate the frenzy of a decade into the foundations of a century. The lesson is simple, though never easy. Fraud thrives in shadows. Stability grows from governance. The next era of digital value will belong to those who unite decentralization with trust, freedom with responsibility, innovation with introspection. Their task is not to create money, but to restore meaning to exchange, because value stripped of meaning is noise, and meaning without value is silence. And between the two lies a space we call civilization.